Bien le bonjour and welcome to this third and last part of my video covering the evolution of the warrior and his best friend the berserker through the Final Fantasy main series. Hope you're all nice and comfy, let's go! No jobs again, you know the drill, let's look at the game mechanics and characters. Of the 6 roles, one of them revolved around dealing the highest possible damages, the Commando. Labeling it as the warrior can be a stretch, as it could also use the neutral type magic Ruin and its AoE version Ruin-Gap. It was usually paired with another role, called the Ravager, that relied on elemental skills and spells. The Ravager was useful for filling the chain gauge faster despite its lower damage output, whereas the Commando had to slow down the gauge depletion. Once the enemy was staggered, the Ravager could then keep on adding more bonus to the chain gauge as the Commando saw its numbers rising ever higher. In the literal sense as well, because the Commando was the only role which had the launch ability. As the name implied, this ability launched a staggered opponent in the air and would prevent any kind of counterattacks, as long as it was still in suspension and staggered. Between the 6 heroes, Lightning fit the warrior stereotype the best with her sword, that could turn into a gun, true, I'll cover that in the Gunblade video, as well as her affinity with the Commando role, and Ravager in a lesser way, but also thanks to her backstory as a soldier and her Eidolon, Odin. Because this episode only had 2 main characters, they both had a lot of abilities complementing each other, making it quite hard to associate them with a known FF job. Purely from a design standpoint and character backstory, Noel fit the melee class's archetype with his 2 swords which could be assembled into a javelin and his past as a hunter, but I will avoid spoilers. Stats-wise, Noel had more HP and strength, but he could also act as a good magic and synergist, the role specialized in buffs, thanks to his AoE spells. Even his exclusive Commando skill, Meteor Javelin, looked like something from a dragoon rather than a warrior. Lightning's design in this game already made her appear as a warrior or a knight, but you still could find the Amazon Warrior Garb that had Soul of the Warrior, which upgraded your HP and strength. It's also worth noting that an event in FF14 added that great axe made of ice used by Snow as a marauder and warrior weapon, now being only available through the Markshop. Here the warrior is a job, an upgrade from the marauder class that uses the great axe as a weapon and sports the tank role like in FF11, but stays efficient even at max level. Let's not waste time on the marauder that just acted as a base for the job, just like all the other classes. The Berserker part is far more upfront and mostly shown through the visual effects and names of the actions, such as Berserk, yes, again, and its strongest skill Inner Chaos, but also through his secondary resource called the Beast Gauge. This resource is mostly generated thanks to the second and third skills of a combo, and it is consumed by using some rather strong actions, or at least useful ones such as Onslaught, that makes you quickly rush towards your target. Be careful to not be carried away by your impetuosity. You see, this job's story revolves around the idea of taming your inner beast. Some sort of restless fury that some individuals have in the world of FF14. Contrary to the previous games, here you must never let your rage take a hold of yourself and lose control. However, if you can tame it, you will be able to draw from this wrath and improve your protector's abilities, such as Nascent Flash that increases slightly an ally's overall defense, on top of healing them a bit thanks to the damages you deal while it lasts, or Shake It Off that puts an absorb shield on your whole party. Also, you have to admit that it's quite an interesting concept. Who needs those clichés like the power of light or darkness to help you, when you just need to be really short-tempered? Or a MOBA player. This anger culminates in the invincible CD named Holmgang. Your ire keeps you alive with at least 1 HP whatever your opponents throw at you, save for some rare cases. Unfortunately, considering the ever-changing nature of an MMORPG and the changes brought from one patch or expansion to the other, I can't compare the warrior's DPS and survivability to the other tanks. But it's pulling its weight, at least a lot better than in the other Final Fantasy games. Even if it looks more Berserker than Warrior when we think about it. Anyway, time to cover the last game. We are finally at the last stop of our journey retracing the evolution of the Warrior class. Yet, we had to examine the characters to see who deserved this label. As I formerly explained in the gameplay mechanics videos, Noctis could equip every kind of weapon for a total of 4 at the same time, on top of starting the game with already 3 different ones equipped by default. Adding to this his stats that weren't really great from a melee standpoint, he couldn't really apply for the job presented in this video. However, that was the case for his friend Gladiolus. Seriously, look at this glorious specimen. That was not purely for show, since he had the best HP, strength and defense between all his comrades, as well as being able to use greatswords, with one hand while using a shield with the other one. He didn't usurp his place as the Prince Noctis' bodyguard, which seemed to be his family's sworn duty. I'm aware that with the whole royal bodyguard shtick, the sword and the shield, we were closer to the knight rather than the warrior. But that's not the first time I had to cheat a bit for this topic, right? Before we end this, let's cover some differences in the way you played Gladio compared to Noctis. Although both of them could activate a defense mode by holding the assigned button, they were quite distinct from one another. Noctis could stay in defense since his MPs were consumed only when he automatically dodged, or successfully blocked when his active weapon was a shield. In any case, if you managed to defend against one of those enemy attacks signaled by a rather obvious visual cue by default, Noctis would parry, then the action would drastically slow down, allowing you to counterattack. This counter could range from a simple attack to a small cutscene depending on the monster and even the skill you parried. For Gladiolus, it wasn't that simple as his MP gauge was constantly drained while in defense mode, with no additional cost if you actually blocked something. Quite ironic for the tank of the game now that I think about it. There was no visual cue either, but this actually meant that you could parry every enemy skills with the right timing, unless they had the unstoppable buff, and therefore follow up with a counterattack. If you feel like this was too much work, well, there was an additional benefit to Gladio's more demanding playstyle. Whenever he was hit, whether you blocked or not, he would gain a DPS buff stacking up to 4 times the damages, and it decreased slowly over time in battle. So you had to juggle between blocking to keep the buff and attacking, but parrying would increase the bonus far more than passively waiting in defense mode or getting directly hit. This damage boosting mechanic was called Rage. Okay, I'll stop doing that. You can see that Gladio had even the Berserker job, or almost. Second and last important mechanic, the Valor gauge. Not that it was a real innovation, because it was basically a limit break feature. Whenever you managed to hit your targets, it would fill up, and once you reach some thresholds, you could use a special skill that would completely deplete the gauge. The skill depended on the amount of rage and how much you progressed in the episode Gladiolus DLC. Small funny anecdote, or not, the French localization actually called that second mechanic Rage Gauge, while they called the first one the damage rate. And that's all I had to say on the evolution of the Warrior and the Berserker, and the Knight sometimes too, through the main Final Fantasy games. We can see that although the Warrior had a rough start, often acting as the first step towards better classes, it managed, thanks to the brave sacrifice of the Berserker, to make its way up in the big league. At least in the MMORPG episodes. Thanks for your time and making it this far. Prenez soin de vous et amusez-vous bien.